Good morning, church. Let me read to you from Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 21. Afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain and called out the ones he wanted to go with him. And they came to him. Then he appointed 12 of them and called them his apostles. They were to accompany him, and he would send them out to preach, giving them the authority to cast out demons. These are the 12 he chose: Simon, whom he named Peter, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who would later betray him. Looking at verse 14, we see that there are three tasks that are given to the disciples. First, they are called to accompany Jesus. Second, they are called and sent out to preach. And third, they're given the authority to cast out demons. Let's unpack these a little and see how it might apply to us. The disciples are called to accompany or be with Jesus. Some translations say that Jesus appointed the 12 to be with him as opposed to accompanying him. This might be splitting hairs, but I think that it's important because Jesus is not simply looking for someone to spend time with or companionship, but rather he's calling these men to himself because they will one day carry on his work. In order to carry on this work, they're going to need to be with him for a period of time, learning from him by listening. They're going to have to observe Jesus, and then eventually they're going to end up being witnesses of his death and his resurrection. Now, obviously, we can't physically walk and talk with Jesus like the disciples did. However, there are ways in which we can be with Jesus. We can spend time in God's written word. We can spend time in prayer. We can spend time in the church. Just like the disciples, our effectiveness is going to be dependent on the time that we spend with Jesus. Next, the disciples are sent out to preach. The disciples are called to share the good news. Evangelism is a primary task of the disciples. We know that they preached some while they were with Jesus, but after the ascension, the disciples went to preach all over the known world. Here's what Scripture and church history tells us about the preaching and death of the disciples. Peter preached in Galatia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and much of Asia Minor. And he may have been the founder of the church in Rome, and he was later crucified upside down. Andrew preached around the Black Sea, perhaps going as far north as modern-day Ukraine and Romania. He was martyred on an X-shaped cross in Greece, and there's an account that for 2 days while he hung on that cross, he continued to preach. James, he was decapitated by Herod. He preached in Iberia, which is modern-day Spain, as well as in the Holy Land. John preached across much of Asia Minor. He's the only apostle who didn't die of martyrdom. He died of old age, but he certainly suffered for the cause of Christ. Philip went on to preach in Greece, Syria, and Phrygia. There are conflicting accounts on how he died. Some say he was crucified, others say he was beheaded. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, is said to have gone to India, Ethiopia, Mesopotamia. And one account says that he was flayed alive, and another said he was beheaded. Matthew preached in the Holy Land and later in Ethiopia. He was killed by a sword wound. The other James preached in and around Jerusalem. He was martyred by being thrown from the temple wall in Jerusalem, surviving but then being beaten to death with a club. Thomas traveled to India and established 7 churches there. He was martyred during one of his missions to southwestern India. Simon the Zealot preached in Egypt, and perhaps later in Persia, and there are differing accounts on how he was martyred, but he was martyred nonetheless. He was either crucified or sawn in half. Thaddeus, also known as Jude or Judas, but not Judas Iscariot, he preached in Judea, Samaria, Syria, and other places. He was martyred by axe or clubbed to death. As the disciples were called to preach, so the church and each of us is called to bear witness of the risen Christ. It may be in a faraway place, like many of these disciples did, or it may just be to your neighbor. Either way, we are called to share the good news of Jesus. Third, the disciples are given the authority to cast out demons. The disciples were given this authority. And if you're interested in spiritual warfare, I encourage you to come on Wednesday nights. Pastor Jeff will be leading a discussion on this topic. But as far as application with this right now, I'm going to take a little liberty here and broaden this. We are called through the power of Christ to fight against sin and Satan. Spiritual warfare is certainly part of this, but it's also doing more. It's pushing out evil so that people may see Christ. We want people to be delivered, and we want people to be open to God. It's speaking the truth. It's helping our neighbor. It's caring for the sick, plus more. In short, to sum all this up, we are called to be with Christ and spend time with him. We are called to bear witness to Christ and tell others about him. And we are to act with the power of Christ in doing good. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me. I'll see you next week.